Some women are given away with a blessing, others are delivered like a debt. The carriage wheels cut through the mud as rain hammered against the narrow windows, each drop striking like a ticking clock counting down the last moments of Elena Brooks' old life. She sat motionless, fingers clenched tightly in the worn fabric of her coat, not from fear alone, but from the quiet understanding that nothing she said or did would change what waited at the end of this road. Across from her, the man who had escorted her spoke only once during the entire journey, his voice flat, almost bored. "You should be grateful, miss. Most debts are paid with worse." But gratitude had long since abandoned her, left behind somewhere between the unpaid bills and her brother's fragile breaths back home. The carriage slowed as iron gates emerged through the storm like something carved from shadow, towering and unwelcoming. And beyond them stood Hale Manor, vast and silent, its stone walls rising into the dark sky as though they had never known warmth. When the door opened, the cold air struck her face, sharp and immediate. And for a brief second she considered not stepping out, considered letting the storm take her instead, but then she saw her brother's face in her mind and moved forward. Inside, the grand hall swallowed sound, her footsteps echoing against marble floors polished to a lifeless shine, candles flickering along the walls but offering no comfort, only long, trembling shadows. "He's waiting," the butler said, his tone precise, emotionless, and she nodded. Without speaking, because words felt useless here, Sebastian Hale stood near the far end of the room, tall, unmoving, as though he had been carved from the same cold stone as the manor itself. And when his eyes finally lifted to meet hers, they held no curiosity, no cruelty, only a quiet, measured indifference that somehow felt heavier than either. He studied her briefly, not as a man looks at a woman, but as one might assess a contract, a transaction already agreed upon, and when he spoke, his voice was low, controlled, leaving no space for misunderstanding. "You're here because your family couldn't pay," he said, as if stating a simple fact of weather. "And now, you will." Elena felt the words settle over her like chains she could not see but already felt tightening. Yet she did not lower her gaze, did not beg, because there was nothing left in her to bargain with. "I didn't choose this," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the storm still raging beyond the walls. A flicker crossed his expression then, so brief it could have been imagined, but his reply came without hesitation, colder than before. "Neither did I." Silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating, as the weight of that truth settled into the room. And in that moment something shifted, something neither of them yet understood, because while she stood there believing she had been brought to serve a man without a heart, Sebastian Hale found himself unsettled for the first time in years, not by her presence, not by her beauty, but by the simple, dangerous fact that she did not break. The door to her room closed with a soft but final click, the kind that did not echo loudly, yet somehow made it clear there was no turning back. Elena stood still for a moment, her hand resting against the cool wood, as if she could feel the weight of the entire manor pressing on the other side. Then slowly she turned, taking in the space that was now meant to be hers. A room far grander than anything she had ever known, yet entirely devoid of warmth. The bed perfectly made, untouched. The fireplace already lit, but offering a heat that felt distant rather than comforting, as though even the fire had learned not to linger here. She moved cautiously, placing her small travel bag on the edge of a polished table, her reflection catching briefly in the tall mirror across the room. A woman who looked composed from a distance, but whose eyes carried the quiet exhaustion of someone who had already given up too much. Somewhere down the corridor, footsteps passed, measured and controlled. And she knew without being told that this house functioned with precision, every movement observed, every silence deliberate. She removed her gloves slowly, fingers stiff from the cold, and for the first time since arriving, she allowed herself a single, unsteady breath, not a sob, not even close, just a moment where the mask slipped enough for her shoulders to lower before she straightened again, because even alone, she refused to appear broken. Across the manor, Sebastian stood in his study, staring into the fire that burned brighter there than anywhere else in the house. Though it did little to soften the lines of his expression, he had expected resistance, fear, perhaps even tears, the usual responses that made situations like this simple. to manage, but instead there had been something else, something quiet and unyielding in the way she held herself, and it lingered in his thoughts longer than it should have. She will require proper arrangements, the housekeeper said from the doorway, her voice careful, respectful, and he nodded without turning. Ensure she has everything necessary, he replied, his tone even, as though the matter required no further consideration. Yet after a pause, he added, almost as an afterthought, and see that she is not disturbed tonight. The words leaving him before he fully considered why. The housekeeper inclined her head and withdrew, leaving him alone once more, though the solitude did not settle as easily as it once had. Elena moved toward the window, drawn by the faint sound of rain still falling against the glass, softer now but steady, and beyond it stretched the vast grounds of the estate, dark and endless. Offering no sign of the world she had left behind, she reached into her bag and carefully removed a folded piece of paper, worn at the edges, and held it close for a moment before opening it. Her brother's handwriting uneven but familiar, each word a quiet reminder of why she was here, why she had stepped out of that carriage instead of letting the storm take her. Her fingers tightened slightly around the letter, not enough to crease it, never that, and she closed her eyes just briefly, allowing the memory of his voice to steady her before she placed it carefully on the table beside the bed, as if it were the most valuable thing in the room. Somewhere in the silence, the distance between two strangers within the same house began to shift, not visibly, not yet, but in the smallest, most dangerous way, because for the first time in years, Sebastian Hale found himself listening for something beyond his own thoughts, and Elena Brooks, standing alone in a place that did not want her, refused to disappear into it. Morning arrived without warmth, the gray light slipping through the tall windows like something unwelcome, quiet and persistent, and Elena woke not from rest but from a shallow stillness where sleep had only brushed against her without staying. For a moment she remained lying there, staring at the unfamiliar ceiling, allowing herself to remember exactly where she was so there would be no shock when she rose, no fragile illusion to break, only reality waiting exactly as it had been left the night before. She sat up slowly, the room unchanged, the fire reduced to faint embers, the silence intact, and as her feet touched the cold floor she steadied herself with a small breath. Gathering the composure she wore as carefully as any fine garment. A soft knock came at the door, precise and measured, and when she opened it, a maid stood waiting with a tray, her expression polite but distant, as though unsure what place Elena held within the house. "Breakfast, miss," she said quietly, placing it on the table before retreating without another word. Elena glanced at the untouched spread, more food than she could remember seeing it once in months. Yet she did not reach for it immediately, instead moving to the window again, drawn by habit more than curiosity, watching as the rain had eased into a fine mist that clung to the grounds like a veil. Somewhere beyond those trees was the life she had left behind, the small room, the quiet struggles, her brother's fragile smile, and the distance between that world and this one felt immeasurable. She forced herself to turn away, to sit, to eat at least a few bites, because she knew she would need her strength here, though she could not yet name the battles she would face. Across the manor, Sebastian walked the long corridor with deliberate steps, his presence enough to still the movement of anyone who crossed his path, servants lowering their eyes as he passed, the atmosphere shifting subtly in his wake. And yet his thoughts were not on the matters that usually occupied him, not on accounts or land or obligations, but on a quiet room at the far end of the east wing and the woman within it who had accepted her fate without resistance yet without surrender. He paused briefly outside a window overlooking the grounds, his reflection faint against the glass, and for reasons he did not examine too closely. He altered his course, his steps turning toward the east wing before he could reconsider. Elena had just set aside her cup when she heard the sound of the door opening without warning, not abruptly, but with a controlled certainty that left no doubt as to who stood there, and she rose immediately, instinct guiding her posture into one of calm respect, though her hands remained steady at her sides. Sebastian entered without haste, his gaze moving over the room once before settling on her, and for a moment neither of them spoke, the silence stretching between them, not hostile, not yet, but filled with something unspoken. "You will find that this house operates by routine," he said at last, his voice even, as though continuing a conversation that had never begun. "You are expected to adapt to it." Elena inclined her head slightly, her voice quiet but clear when she answered, "I understand." And there it was again, that absence of fear, that refusal to plead or protest. And it unsettled him more than defiance ever could. His eyes lingered on her for a fraction, longer than necessary before he turned toward the door. But before leaving, he added, almost without intention, "If you require anything, you will inform the staff." A simple statement, practical, detached, yet carrying a trace of something unfamiliar, something that did not belong to the man he had been before she arrived. When the door closed behind him, Elena remained standing where she was, her gaze fixed on the space he had just occupied, and though nothing had changed in the room, nothing had softened, she felt it nonetheless, the faintest shift in the air, as though something had begun without either of them choosing it, quiet, unseen, and impossible to undo. The day moved forward with a quiet precision that felt almost unnatural, as though the entire manor existed to maintain order rather than life. And Elena quickly learned that every corridor, every door, every glance from the staff carried an unspoken rule she was expected to understand without explanation. She walked slowly through the east wing after finishing her meal, her steps measured, her posture composed, observing without drawing attention, because she knew instinctively that survival here would depend not on resistance, but on awareness. The walls were lined with portraits, generations of faces captured in oil and shadow, their expressions distant, proud, and unmoving, and she could not help but feel that she had entered a place where time had not passed so much as it had settled, heavy and unchanging. A maid passed her with a polite nod, hesitation flickering just beneath the surface, as if unsure whether to treat her as mistress or outsider. And Elena acknowledged her gently, offering the smallest smile, not out of warmth, but out of quiet dignity, the kind that asked for nothing yet refused to be diminished. In another part of the house, Sebastian sat at his desk, papers spread before him, yet his attention wandered in subtle, persistent ways, his thoughts returning to the same unexpected point, the calm steadiness in her voice, the absence of fear in her eyes, and it unsettled him in a manner he could not justify, because it introduced a variable he had not accounted for. He was accustomed to control, to predictable reactions, to the clear lines that defined obligation and distance, and yet with her, those lines felt less certain, as though they might shift if he looked away for too long. He rose abruptly, pushing the chair back with controlled force, as if motion alone could silence the unease, and stepped into the corridor once more, his pace slower now, more deliberate, until he found himself once again near the east wing without consciously deciding to go there. Elena paused at the end of the hallway where a tall window overlooked the gardens, the gray sky pressing low over the land, the damp air softening the edges of everything it touched, and for a moment she allowed herself to imagine what it would feel like to walk beyond those gates freely, not as someone bound by obligation, but as someone who could choose her own direction. Yet the thought faded as quickly as it came, replaced by the quiet acceptance she had carried with her since the beginning. Footsteps approached behind her, unmistakable in their steadiness, and she did not turn immediately, not out of defiance, but because she refused to appear startled. And when she finally faced him, her expression remained composed, her gaze level, as though this encounter had been expected. Sebastian stopped a few feet away, the distance precise, controlled, his eyes briefly shifting past her to the gardens before returning, and for a moment neither spoke, the silence again stretching between them, no longer unfamiliar but not yet comfortable. "You will not wander beyond the grounds," he said, his voice calm, firm. A boundary drawn without hostility yet impossible to ignore, and Elena inclined her head slightly. "I understand," she replied, the same quiet certainty in her tone, no argument, no hesitation, and that response lingered longer than it should have. He studied her again, searching perhaps for something that would restore the balance he was used to, but finding only the same composed stillness. And for the briefest moment, something shifted beneath the surface of his control, not visible, not acknowledged, but present all the same. When he turned to leave, his steps measured as always. The corridor seemed to hold the echo of something unspoken, something that neither of them had chosen, yet both had begun to feel, subtle as a breath, and just as impossible to stop once it had begun. Evening settled over the manor with a slow, deliberate hush, the kind that seemed to press into the walls and linger in the spaces between footsteps. And Elena found herself once again alone in her room, the faint glow of candlelight casting soft shadows that moved with each subtle shift of air. She sat at the small writing table near the window, the letter from her brother carefully unfolded before her fingers tracing the familiar lines of ink as though the act itself might bridge the distance between them. And for a moment her composure wavered, not outwardly, not enough for anyone to see, but just beneath the surface where the weight of everything she carried pressed hardest. She reached into her small bag and removed a delicate silver locket, worn with time, and opened it slowly, revealing a tiny portrait inside, her brother's face younger, healthier, captured before illness had taken its quiet hold. And she closed her eyes briefly, steadying herself before placing it beside the letter, arranging both with careful precision as though order could give her strength. Across the manor, Sebastian stood near the wide windows of his study, the night stretching beyond the glass in deep shades of blue and black, the silence surrounding him heavier than usual, because for the first time in years, it did not feel like solitude. It felt like something waiting. He had gone through the motions of the day, attended to responsibilities, issued instructions, maintained the structure that defined his world. Yet beneath it all there had been a quiet disruption, a presence that did not demand attention but refused to be ignored. He turned from the window, his expression controlled as always, yet his steps carried him once more toward the east wing, not out of obligation, not even curiosity, but something far less defined, something he did not name. Elena rose from her chair, sensing the faint shift in the air before the knock came, soft but certain, and when she opened the door, she found him standing there, his presence filling the space without effort, his gaze steady, unreadable. "You have not requested anything," he said, his voice calm, almost neutral, yet carrying an undercurrent she could not fully place. And for a moment she considered the question beneath the statement, the expectation that she would ask, that she would need, but instead she answered simply, "I have everything I require," her tone respectful, composed, leaving no room for misinterpretation. Something flickered in his eyes then, not irritation, not approval, but something closer to frustration, as though her lack of demand unsettled the balance he was accustomed to. He stepped into the room. Without waiting for invitation, his gaze moving briefly over the table, the letter, the locket, the careful arrangement that spoke more than any words she had offered. And though he said nothing about it, the image fixed itself in his mind with unexpected clarity. "This house is not meant to be endured in silence," he said after a moment, the words quieter now, less certain than before. And Elena met his gaze without hesitation, her reply steady. Silence is often easier than expectation, and the truth of it settled between them, heavy and undeniable. He held her gaze for a fraction longer than necessary before turning away, as though the space itself had become too confined, too revealing. And when he reached the door, he paused, his hand resting briefly against the frame. A small, almost imperceptible hesitation that would have gone unnoticed by anyone else. But she saw it. Not the reason, not the thought behind it. Only the shift, the smallest crack in the control he carried so carefully. And as the door closed behind him, the quiet that followed felt different, no longer empty, no longer still, but filled with something neither of them had yet spoken, something that had begun without permission and would not easily be undone. The night did not bring him rest, and Sebastian knew it before he even closed his eyes, because the silence that once shielded him now carried something unfamiliar, something persistent that followed him from room to room, settling into the spaces he had long ago claimed as his own. He stood in his study long after the candles had burned low, his gaze unfocused as thoughts circled back to the same quiet details. The way her voice did not tremble, the way her eyes did not lower, the way she spoke of silence not as weakness but as choice, and it unsettled him in a way he could neither dismiss nor understand. He had built his world on distance, on control, on the certainty that nothing would reach him unless he allowed it. Yet somehow she had crossed that boundary without effort, without intention, simply by existing within it. Across the manor, Elena lay awake as well, though her stillness made it seem otherwise. Her eyes fixed on the faint outline of the ceiling above her, her thoughts moving in careful, deliberate paths as she measured each moment, each word exchanged, each shift she had sensed in him. Because survival here required more than endurance, it required understanding, and she was beginning to see that beneath his control was something far less stable than it appeared. Morning came with a pale, fragile light that barely softened the cold edges of the manor, and the routine resumed as though nothing had changed. Servants moving with quiet efficiency, doors opening and closing with practiced precision. Yet beneath it all there was a subtle tension, a current that neither spoke of but both felt. Elena stepped into the corridor once more, her movements calm, her presence quiet yet impossible to ignore, and as she made her way toward the gardens, staying within the boundaries she had been given, she noticed the way the staff watched her now, not with uncertainty alone, but with a growing awareness that her place in this house was not as simple as it had first seemed. Sebastian observed from a distance, his position near the far end of the hall allowing him to see without being seen, though he did not fully understand why he had chosen to remain there, why he found himself watching as she paused by the tall windows overlooking the gardens, her gaze steady, her posture composed, as though she had already accepted the confines of this world and chosen to stand within them rather than fight against them. Something about that acceptance unsettled him more than resistance ever could, because it forced him to question the very structure he had relied upon. When he finally stepped forward, his presence cutting through the quiet as it always did, she turned before he spoke, as though she had sensed him, and once again that small, unspoken shift passed between them, the kind that could not be named yet could not be ignored. "You are adapting," he said, his voice measured, not quite a question, not quite a statement, and Elena met his gaze without hesitation. "I am learning," she replied, her tone steady, and the distinction lingered between them, subtle yet significant. He studied her for a moment longer, something tightening beneath the surface of his expression, not anger, not impatience, but something closer to recognition, as though he were beginning to see not just what she was, but what she was not, and it disrupted the certainty he had carried for so long. "This house does not change," he said after a moment, the words quiet but firm, a truth he had lived by, and Elena inclined her head slightly, her voice just as calm when she answered, "Then I will." And there it was. Again, that quiet strength, that refusal to break, and for the first time, Sebastian did not turn away immediately, did not retreat into the distance he knew so well, because something within him had begun to shift, slowly, almost imperceptibly, yet with a certainty that could not be undone, and though he did not yet understand it, he felt it all the same. The first faint fracture in a heart that had long ago learned how not to feel. The shift did not happen all at once, and perhaps that was what made it so dangerous, because neither of them could point to the exact moment when something began to change, yet both of them felt it in the smallest details, in the pauses that lasted a fraction too long, in the glances that lingered just beyond necessity. The days moved forward with the same measured rhythm, the manor unchanged in its structure, its silence, its quiet demands, and yet within that stillness, something subtle had taken root. Elena had begun to establish her own routine, one that did not disrupt the order of the house, but existed quietly within it. Mornings spent near the east windows where the light was softest, afternoons walking the permitted paths along the garden edges, her steps steady, her presence calm, as though she had accepted her place not as surrender, but as a form of quiet control. The staff watched her differently now, their uncertainty replaced with a cautious respect, because she neither demanded nor avoided. She simply existed with a dignity that made it difficult to dismiss her as anything less than what she appeared to be. Sebastian noticed all of it, though he would not have admitted it even to himself. The way she moved without hesitation, the way she spoke only when necessary, the way she carried her silence not as absence but as strength, and it unsettled him in ways he could no longer ignore. He found himself altering his path without reason, appearing in places he had no need to be, lingering in the background of rooms where she might pass, not approaching, not speaking, but watching, observing, as though trying to understand something that did not fit within the boundaries he had built for his world. One afternoon, as the sky cleared for the first time in days, a thin line of sunlight breaking through the gray, Elena stepped farther into the garden than she had before, still within the limits he had set, yet closer to the open space beyond. Her gaze lifted toward the distant horizon, and for a moment she stood completely still, as though measuring the distance between where she was and where she might have been. Sebastian saw her from the upper window, his position granting him a clear view of the grounds, and something in the way she stood there, quiet, composed, yet undeniably separate from the world around her, caught his attention with a force that felt unfamiliar, almost unwelcome. Without thinking, he left the room, his steps quicker than usual, carrying him down the long corridors and out into the open air, the cool breeze sharp against his face as he approached. Elena turned at the sound of his footsteps, her expression unchanged, her posture steady, as though she had expected him even there. Even in that moment that felt almost her own. "You are near the boundary," he said, his voice calm, though something beneath it was less certain than before, and she glanced briefly toward the distant line of trees before returning her gaze to him. "I have not crossed it," she replied, her tone even, factual, and the simplicity of her answer left no room for reprimand. He studied her for a moment, the distance between them smaller now, the air carrying a tension that neither acknowledged, and then, almost without intention, he asked, "Do you wish to?" The question slipping past his control before he could retrieve it. Elena did not answer immediately, her gaze shifting once more toward the horizon. The faintest trace of something softer, something almost like longing passing through her expression before it settled again into calm composure. "Wishing does not change what is," she said quietly, and the truth of it settled between them with a weight that neither could dismiss. For the first time, Sebastian did not have a response, did not retreat into the certainty of command or distance, because something in her words mirrored a truth he had buried long ago, and as he stood there, closer to her than he had ever intended, he felt it again, stronger now, undeniable, the slow, steady unraveling of a control he had believed unbreakable, and though he did not yet name it, did not yet understand it, the realization had begun to take shape all the same, quiet, inevitable, and far more dangerous than either of them could see. The air between them did not return to what it had been before, and perhaps it never would, because something had shifted too deeply to be undone by silence or distance. Elena turned away from the horizon first, not out of submission, but because she understood that standing there any longer would only invite questions neither of them were ready to answer, and she walked back along the garden path with measured steps, her posture composed, her expression calm, leaving him standing where he was, watching her retreat, not as one watches something insignificant, but as one watches something that has begun to matter without permission. Sebastian remained still for a moment longer than necessary, the echo of her words lingering in his mind, and when he finally turned, there was a subtle tension in the way he moved, a restraint that felt less like control and more like resistance, as though he were holding back something he had not yet allowed himself to name. The rest of the day unfolded, with the same quiet order, yet beneath it all, there was an awareness that had not existed before, a constant, unspoken connection that neither acknowledged yet both felt, threading through the silence like something alive. Elena spent the afternoon in the East Wing, her attention focused on small tasks that gave her a sense of purpose, arranging what little she had brought, adjusting the space around her not to claim it, but to survive within it. And yet, even in those quiet moments, she found herself thinking of the question he had asked, simple yet impossible, and she pushed it aside with the same discipline she used for everything else, because allowing herself to feel anything beyond acceptance would only make this place harder to endure. As evening approached, the manor grew quieter still, the fading light casting long shadows that stretched across the floors and walls, and Elena moved toward the window once more, her gaze drawn to the dim outline of the gardens below, where the last traces of daylight clung stubbornly to the edges of the world. She did not hear him enter this time, not until his voice broke the silence, softer than before, less certain. "You spend much of your time here," and she turned, her expression unchanged, though something in her eyes reflected a quiet awareness of his presence that had not been there before. "It is quiet," she replied, her tone even, and he studied her for a moment, as though searching for something beyond the simplicity of her words. "There are other rooms," he said, not as a command, not even as a suggestion, but as an observation that carried an undercurrent he could not conceal, and Elena inclined her head slightly. "This one is enough," she answered, and again. That quiet refusal to want more unsettled him in ways he could not ignore. He stepped closer then, not enough to close the distance completely, but enough that the space between them felt different, charged with something neither of them had agreed to acknowledge, and his gaze shifted briefly to the table where her letter lay, the edges worn, the presence of it constant, and though he did not ask, the question lingered all the same. "You hold on to what you cannot change," he said quietly, and for a moment, something flickered in her expression, not weakness, not quite, but something softer, something real, before it settled again into calm composure. "It is all I have left to hold," she replied, and the truth of it struck deeper than he expected, because it revealed not desperation, but choice, the deliberate act of preserving something fragile in a world that offered no guarantees. The silence that followed was different from before, no longer empty, no longer neutral, but filled with something heavier, something that pressed against the boundaries he had spent years reinforcing. And for the first time, Sebastian did not turn away immediately, did not retreat into the safety of distance, because something within him had begun to resist that instinct, to question it, to challenge the very foundation of the control he had relied upon. When he finally stepped back, the movement slower than usual, the space between them felt altered, no longer defined by obligation alone, and as he left the room, closing the door with the same measured quiet, he carried with him a realization he could no longer ignore, that whatever this was, whatever had begun between them, it was no longer something he could contain. And though he did not yet understand it, did not yet accept it, it had already begun to change him in ways that would not easily be undone. The realization did not arrive as a sudden revelation, but as something quieter, more dangerous, because it settled into him without asking permission, taking shape in the spaces he once controlled with certainty. Sebastian found himself standing once more at the threshold of the East Wing, though he could not recall deciding to come there, his presence drawn by something he had not yet named, something that felt less like choice and more like inevitability. The manor was silent at this hour, the kind of silence that carried weight, pressing into the walls and stretching through the corridors, and yet within that stillness, he felt a pull that disrupted the order he had built so carefully over the years. Elena sat by the window again, the faint glow of candlelight reflecting softly against the glass, her figure still, composed, yet undeniably present in a way that made the room feel less empty than it should have been. The letter lay open before her, her fingers resting lightly against the worn edges, as though she drew strength from its existence alone, and when she sensed him, she did not startle, did not turn immediately. Only after a moment did she shift her gaze toward him, her expression calm, though something beneath it had changed, something quieter, more aware. "You do not sleep," he said, his voice lower than before, not a question, not quite an observation, but something in between, and she met his gaze without hesitation. "Sleep comes when the mind allows it," she replied, her tone steady, and again, her words carried a truth that lingered longer than they should have. He stepped into the room slowly, not with authority, not with the deliberate command he once carried so easily, but with a hesitation that felt unfamiliar even to himself, his gaze moving briefly over the table, the letter, the locket, the small fragments of a life she refused to let go of, and something tightened within him, not discomfort, not quite, but something closer to recognition, as though he were beginning to understand the quiet strength that defined her. "You hold on to something that cannot be brought here," he said after a moment, his voice softer now, less certain, and Elena lowered her gaze briefly to the letter before looking back at him. "It is not meant to be brought here," she said, and the simplicity of her answer carried more weight than any explanation could have. The silence that followed was no longer empty, no longer neutral, but filled with something unspoken, something that neither of them had agreed to yet both had begun to feel. And for the first time, Sebastian did not look away, did not retreat into the distance he had relied upon for so long. Because something within him resisted that instinct, challenged it, refused to allow it to remain unchanged. He took another step closer, the distance between them narrowing in a way that felt both deliberate and uncertain, and his gaze lingered on her, not assessing, not dismissing, but searching, as though he were trying to understand something that could not be explained through logic or control. "You are not what I expected," he said, quietly, the words leaving him before he could reconsider them. And for a moment, something shifted in her expression, not surprise, not quite, but something softer, something that suggested she had already known. This without needing him to say it. "Neither are you," she replied, her voice just as calm, just as steady, and the truth of it settled between them with a weight that could not be ignored. He exhaled slowly, the tension within him no longer something he could dismiss, no longer something he could contain, and in that moment, he understood something he had not allowed himself to consider before, something that had been building quietly, steadily, without permission, that whatever this was, whatever had begun between them, it was no longer bound by obligation alone. He turned then, not abruptly, not as an escape, but with a measured control that no longer felt entirely his own, and as he left the room, the silence that followed was no longer the same, because it carried with it the undeniable truth that something had shifted beyond his control, and for the first time in years, Sebastian Hale walked away not with certainty, but with the quiet, unsettling realization that he had already begun to lose something he had never intended to give. The awareness did not fade with distance, and that was what unsettled him most, because even as Sebastian returned to the familiar structure of his routine, the quiet certainty he had relied upon no longer held the same weight, as though something unseen had begun to shift the foundation beneath it. The morning arrived with its usual precision, the manor waking in silence, every movement measured, every detail in place, yet for him, there was a subtle disruption that could not be ignored, a lingering presence that followed him through corridors and rooms, not visible, not spoken, yet undeniably there. Elena moved through the East Wing with the same calm composure she had maintained since her arrival, her routine steady, her presence quiet yet defined, and though nothing in her behavior demanded attention, everything about her existence within the house seemed to draw it. The staff no longer hesitated in her presence, yet there remained a careful awareness, a recognition that she was not simply passing through this place, but becoming part of it in a way that was not easily dismissed. Sebastian observed the shift without acknowledging it, his gaze lingering a moment longer than necessary when she crossed the hall, his steps slowing almost imperceptibly when their paths aligned. And though he maintained the distance he had always enforced, it no longer felt absolute, no longer felt secure. It was during the late afternoon, when the light began to fade and the manor settled into its quieter hours, that something changed in a way neither of them could ignore. Elena had returned to her room after a brief walk along the garden path, the air still carrying the coolness of the lingering season, and she moved to the table as she always did, her attention drawn once more to the letter she had read so many times, the edges worn, the ink slightly faded, yet the meaning unchanged. She sat, her fingers resting lightly against the paper, her gaze distant, and for a moment, the composure she carried so carefully slipped just enough to reveal the quiet weight she bore, not in tears, not in visible grief, but in the stillness that settled over her when she allowed herself to feel what she otherwise kept contained. Sebastian saw it not by intention, but by chance, the door not fully closed, the angle of the corridor offering a brief, unguarded glimpse into a moment that was not meant to be witnessed, and something within him tightened in a way he had not expected. Because what he saw was not weakness, not fragility, but something far more difficult to understand, a strength that existed not in the absence of pain, but in the choice to carry it without allowing it to define her. He did not enter, did not announce his presence, yet he did not turn away immediately either, his gaze fixed for a fraction longer than it should have been, as though he were trying to understand something that could not be explained through logic or control. When she finally moved, lifting the letter, folding it carefully, restoring the composure she never allowed others to see falter, He stepped back, the moment closing, as quietly as it had opened, yet its impact remained. Later that evening, when their paths crossed once more, the air between them felt different, not heavier, not tense, but altered in a way that could not be undone. And when he spoke, his voice carried something that had not been there before, something quieter, more deliberate. "You do not have to carry everything alone," he said, the words simple, yet unfamiliar in his own voice. And Elena looked at him, truly looked at him for the first time in a way that held something beyond calm composure, something that recognized the shift beneath his control. "Some things cannot be shared," she replied softly, and though her tone remained steady, there was a gentleness there that had not existed before. The silence that followed was no longer empty, no longer neutral, but filled with a quiet understanding that neither had chosen yet both had begun to accept. And as Sebastian stood there, closer to her than he had ever intended, he realized something that could no longer be denied, that whatever distance he had tried to maintain, whatever control he had relied upon, it was no longer enough, because somewhere between the silence and the unspoken moments, he had begun to care, not as obligation, not as duty, but as something far more dangerous, something that could not be undone once fully realized. The change could no longer be ignored, not by him, not by the quiet rhythm of the manor that had begun to shift in subtle, undeniable ways. And yet Sebastian resisted naming it, because to name it would be to accept it, and acceptance was something he had long ago learned to avoid. The days continued with their measured precision, yet beneath that structure, there was a tension that had not existed before, a constant awareness that followed him even in moments of solitude, because no matter where he went, his thoughts found their way back to her. Elena remained as she had always been, composed, steady, her presence woven into the house without ever demanding space. And yet it was precisely that quiet strength that had begun to alter everything around her. Because she did not change the manner, she changed the way it was seen. It was late afternoon when the moment came, not dramatic, not loud, but decisive in a way that could not be undone. The staff had gathered in the main hall, their voices low, their movements careful, as they prepared for a small but formal dinner, one that required a level of precision and presence Elena had not yet been part of. And when she entered, the subtle shift in the room was immediate, not overt, not spoken, but felt all the same. Conversations softened, glances exchanged, and for a brief moment, she stood at the threshold, aware of the attention yet unaffected by it, her posture calm, her gaze steady, as though she had already accepted whatever place she held here, whether defined or not. Sebastian observed from across the room, his presence commanding as always, yet his attention no longer detached, no longer distant, because he saw what others were beginning to see, not a guest, not a burden, but something far more difficult to define. One of the guests, a man accustomed to the rigid expectations of status and propriety, allowed his gaze to linger a moment too long, his tone carrying a subtle edge when he spoke. "I was not aware the house had taken in new company," and, though the words were measured, their meaning was not lost on anyone present. The silence that followed was brief but heavy, the kind that waits for resolution, for correction, for someone to restore the order that had been disrupted. Elena did not respond immediately, not because she lacked an answer, but because she understood the weight of the moment, the way it would define not only her place, but the way she would be seen within these walls. Before she could speak, Sebastian moved, the shift in his posture subtle yet unmistakable, his voice cutting through the silence with quiet authority. "She belongs here," he said, the words simple, direct, leaving no space for interpretation. And though his tone remained controlled, there was something beneath it, something firm, something that did not allow for challenge. The effect was immediate, the tension easing, the conversation redirecting. Yet the impact of his words lingered far longer than the moment itself. Elena met his gaze, then truly met it, and for the first time, there was something unguarded in her expression, not vulnerability, not quite, but something softer, something that acknowledged what he had done without needing to say it. He held her gaze for a fraction longer than necessary before turning away, as though the moment itself had revealed more than he was prepared to confront. But the truth had already settled, quiet, undeniable, because what had begun as obligation had shifted into something else entirely, something that could no longer be controlled or dismissed. And as the evening continued, the manor unchanged in its structure, yet altered in its meaning, one thing became clear in a way that neither of them could ignore, that the distance he had once relied upon had been broken not by force, not by demand, but by something far more powerful, something that had taken root without permission and would not easily be undone. The words he had spoken did not fade with the passing of the evening, and though the manor returned to its usual rhythm, something had been set in motion that could no longer be undone, because for the first time, what had been unspoken was now given form, and once spoken, it could not be taken back. Elena carried that moment with her as she moved through the corridors later that night, her steps quiet, her expression composed. Yet beneath that calm exterior, something had shifted, something she had not allowed herself to acknowledge before, because to acknowledge it would mean to hope, and hope was something she had long ago learned to keep at a distance. Sebastian did not return to the main hall after the dinner concluded, instead retreating to his study where the fire burned low and the silence felt heavier than before, because it no longer offered the same refuge, no longer shielded him from the thoughts he had spent years avoiding. He stood there for a long time, his gaze fixed on nothing, yet his mind returning again and again to the same moment, the way the room had stilled, the way his voice had carried without hesitation, the way he had claimed something he had never intended to claim. It had not been planned, not calculated, and that was what unsettled him most, because it meant that what he felt was no longer governed by control. The realization settled slowly, not as a shock, but as something inevitable, something that had been building quietly from the moment she stepped into his world, and now it had reached a point where it could no longer be denied. Elena paused outside the window in the east wing once more, the night stretching endlessly beyond the glass, the faint reflection of her own image staring back at her, and for the first time since her arrival, she allowed herself to ask a question she had carefully avoided, not about her circumstances, not about the life she had left behind, but about him, about the man who had begun to change in ways neither of them had expected. She did not have an answer, only the quiet awareness that something had shifted, something that could not be undone. The following morning brought a cold clarity that neither of them could ignore, because what had once been subtle was now impossible to dismiss, and though neither spoke of it, their actions carried the weight of that understanding. Sebastian found himself in the east wing before he had intended to be there, his steps slower than usual, his presence no longer defined by distance alone. And when he saw her standing by the window, the light catching softly against her features, something within him stilled in a way he could not explain. He did not announce himself immediately, did not break the moment, because for a brief second, he allowed himself to see her not as obligation, not as responsibility, but as something entirely separate from the life he had built. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than it had ever been, stripped of its usual certainty. "You should not remain here as though you are only passing through." And Elena turned, her gaze meeting his with a calm that had never wavered, though something within it had softened, something that acknowledged the truth behind his words. "This was never meant to be a place I belong," she replied, and the honesty of it struck deeper than anything else she had said, because it revealed the distance she still held, the boundary she refused to cross. He stepped closer then, not out of authority, not out of obligation, but because something within him no longer allowed him to remain where he was, and though the space between them remained, it no longer felt the same. "It is now," he said, the words quiet, yet carrying a certainty that had nothing to do with duty, nothing to do with the arrangement that had brought her there, but everything to do with something far more personal, something he could no longer deny. The silence that followed was not empty, not uncertain, but filled with the weight of what had finally been acknowledged, and though neither of them spoke further, the truth had already taken hold, because in that moment, what had once been unspoken became undeniable, and for the first time, Sebastian Hale stood not as a man in control, but as a man who had already fallen without realizing it, and Elena Brooks, who had been brought there without choice, now stood at the center of something neither of them could escape. The truth did not demand to be spoken again, because it had already settled into the space between them, quiet yet immovable, and from that moment forward, Nothing within the manor felt entirely the same. The walls still stood, the routines still unfolded with their familiar precision, yet beneath it all, something had shifted in a way that could not be undone. Because what had once been obligation had transformed into something far more fragile, far more dangerous. Elena remained by the window. For a long moment after his words, her reflection faint against the glass, her thoughts moving in careful, deliberate silence, because she understood what he had said, not just the meaning of it, but the weight behind it. And though she had spent her entire life learning not to hope, she could not deny that something within her had responded, quietly, cautiously, like a flame that refused to fully ignite, yet could no longer be extinguished. Sebastian did not move immediately either, his presence still, his gaze fixed on her as though he were seeing her for the first time without the barrier of control, without the distance he had once relied upon. And in that stillness, he recognized something he had not allowed himself to feel in years, not certainty, not control, but vulnerability, the kind that came not from weakness, but from caring too deeply for something he could not afford to lose. The days that followed did not bring dramatic change, no sudden declarations, no grand gestures, but rather a quiet unfolding, a gradual shift that revealed itself in the smallest of moments, in the way he no longer avoided her presence, in the way his voice softened without intention, in the way he began to notice details he had once ignored, the way she paused before speaking, the way she held onto the letter as though it were the only constant in a world that had taken everything else. Elena, in turn, did not step closer, did not allow herself to believe in something she had not chosen. Yet there was a difference now, a subtle easing of the distance she had maintained, not because she trusted him entirely, but because she had begun to see the man beneath the control, the quiet struggle he carried, the way he had changed without realizing it. It was in the late afternoon, when the lights softened across the gardens and the air carried the faint promise of something new, that they found themselves standing together once more, not by design, not by intention, but because their paths no longer seemed to move in separate directions. "You still stand at the edge," he said quietly, his gaze following hers toward the distant horizon, and Elena allowed herself a brief, thoughtful pause before answering. "Because I remember what lies beyond it." And there was no bitterness in her voice, only truth, steady and unyielding. He turned slightly then, his attention no longer on the distance, but on her, and for the first time, there was no hesitation in his words, no attempt to restrain what had already taken hold. "And yet you remain," he said, and she met his gaze, her expression calm, though something within it had softened, something that acknowledged not just her own choice, but his as well. "So do you," she replied, and the meaning of it settled between them, quiet yet undeniable, because neither of them had chosen this, and yet neither had turned away. The silence that followed was not empty, not uncertain, but filled with something steady, something real, and though the future remained undefined, though the boundaries that had once separated them still lingered in the distance, one truth remained clear in a way that neither of them could ignore, that what had begun without choice had grown into something neither of them could control, something that did not demand perfection, did not promise ease, but offered something far more rare, the chance for two guarded hearts to find understanding in the quiet spaces where words were no longer needed. And in that understanding, something new had taken root, not born from comfort, but from the shadows they had both learned to survive, and for the first time, neither of them stood alone within it.